welcome to the Human Being Human. This is the Human Being Human Podcast. This is the Human Being Human Podcast. This is the Human Being Human Podcast. To the Human Being Human Podcast. This is the Human Being Human Podcast.
We were at sea. There is no other adequate expression. On the plains of Nebraska. It was a world almost without a feature. An empty sky, an empty earth. The green plain ran till it touched the skirts of heaven. It is the settlers at which we have the right to marvel. Upon what food do they subsist? What livelihood can repay the human creature for a life spent in this huge sameness? He is cut off from books, from news, from company, from all that can relieve existence. He may walk 5 miles and see nothing, 10, and it is as though he has not moved, 20, and still he is in the midst of the same great level. Robert Louis Stevenson, from his book, Across the Plains, 1869. The earliest pioneers who traveled by wagon across the Great Plains penned their impressions in the numerous journals, diaries, and logbooks they hauled along with them on their perilous journeys to the west. They wrote pages upon pages describing Nebraska's unique features and landscapes, its hidden and lurking dangers, and the vast potential of the countryside's fertile rivers and soil. But mostly, they wrote of their overwhelming awe of being set adrift in an ocean of grass and sky. These intrepid travelers, however, were not the first human beings to cast themselves upon these open seas. The first folks to speak of the plains arrived here 10,000 years before, traveling not by horse or wagon, but by foot, through ice, glaciers, and frozen flat water. The story of how the first human beings found their way into Nebraska began 75,000 years ago on the opposite side of planet Earth. It was here, on the island of Sumatra in Indonesia, that the same geological forces that shaped Nebraska and North America would forever alter the course of human history. With a force 5,000 times bigger than Mount St. Helens, the largest volcanic eruption in the last 2 million years exploded with immense destructiveness, sending up massive plumes of ash and debris that spread for thousands of miles, causing global climatic disruption. Known as the Mount Toba Catastrophe, this colossal geological event left a caldera 60 miles wide in its aftermath. Our human ancestors living in Africa were greatly impacted by darkened skies and plummeting temperatures, reducing our population into a bottleneck so great that it can still be seen in our DNA. Armed with nothing but our ingenuity, reliance on one another, and sheer willpower, human beings weathered a 1,000-year cold snap that may have driven our species to the brink of extinction. After the dust had settled and the winds had calmed, the survivors of this chaotic time turned their sights towards the lands beyond Africa, and either by necessity or the instinctual spirit of exploration, began blazing a trail on every continent across the globe. Each one of us listening, every human being living today, represents the fruition of the people who, long ago, planted their roots across planet Earth. To speak plainly of these folks, these were the first Nebraskans. Welcome to the Human Being Human podcast. I'm your creator and host, Carrington Cooper. If you've made it this far and decided this podcast isn't for you, well, I appreciate you making it all this way. If you've stuck with this series to this point, our story of Nebraska has taken us through literally billions of years of lava, oceans, jungle, and to the frozen heart of the Ice Age, somewhere around 20,000 years ago. That's a lot to cover in one episode, mainly because this is the Human Being Human podcast, and our story hasn't included any human beings yet. That will change in today's episode, as we introduce the first Nebraskans that lived in my neck of the woods. Neck of the prairie, more accurately, I should say. We'll get to know these groups and communities, and take a deep dive into the history and heritage of the earliest folks that occupied the land that is today the Cornhusker State. What did Nebraska look like when the first people laid eyes upon it thousands of years ago? What would they have spoken of the plains as they made their way to the interior of the continent? Let's begin today's episode as our hunter-gatherer ancestors roam and proud their way into North America for the first time in our long, storied history traversing the planet. The Earth is nearing the end of the Pleistocene epoch, a time period spanning from 2.5 million years ago to just 11,000 years ago. It was during this dynamic time that North America was subjected to repeated glaciations that covered and carved up the countryside. At their glacial maximum, massive ice sheets would have extended south all the way to the 45th parallel, the present-day border of Kansas and Nebraska. These are the great forces that created this land of flat water. The Pleistocene epoch is commonly thought of and referred to as the Ice Age, although there would have been many climatic cycles that oscillated between cold glacial maximums and warmer interglacial periods. In the entirety of Earth's geological history, there have been 5 major ice ages. 6 if you count Disney's Ice Age franchise, a $3 billion critically acclaimed commercial behemoth. Earth's very first ice age, called the Huronian Glaciation, occurred almost 2.5 billion years ago. One particular ice age of note, appropriately called the Cryogenian period, occurred 720 million years ago and resulted in the complete encapsulation of planet Earth by snow and ice. This is known by paleoclimatologists as the snowball Earth or slushball Earth effect, and the entire globe was gripped by cold for more than 300 million years. For a more in-depth insight into the fascinating history of Earth's ice ages, I highly recommend the channels PBS Eons and their videos, That Time Oxygen Almost Killed Everything and How Volcanoes Froze the Earth Twice. Once again, this is a testament to the power and sheer lunacy of free public education. The last glacial episode that occurred in North America and Nebraska lasted from 75,000 years ago to just 11,000 years ago, known as the Wisconsin Glaciation. Many of these Ice Age events are named after the states in which geological evidence was initially excavated. At one point, there was such a thing as the Nebraska Glaciation, but scientists now lump that period in with several others, collectively known as the Pre-Illinoian Glaciation. The furthest southern extent of the Wisconsin Glaciation occurred approximately 21,000 years ago, with ice and glaciers reaching the 40th parallel, which is the modern-day border between Wyoming and Montana. As the name might suggest, these glaciers were largely responsible for the creation and formation of the Great Lakes 14,000 years ago, as well as the Finger Lakes in New York State. These icy forces also played a huge role in the formation of the Ohio River Valley and determined the present-day course of the Missouri River along Nebraska's eastern border. The earliest folks that would speak of the plains would have never known Nebraska as their home without the effects of these glaciers and the Ice Age. Had these powerful forces not yielded their colossal might, the human migration story of North America would have never been possible. When seawater is locked up in mile-high glaciers covering entire continents, it exposes new landmasses previously submerged by deep ocean. The Wisconsin Glaciation allowed for the formation of Beringia, a land bridge that formed between Alaska and Russia 21,000 years ago. Although the geologically correct term for this region is a land bridge, this bridge, quote, was over 600 miles wide and covered an area of more than 6 million square miles. Many such other land bridges formed around the world at this time. The British Isles would have been connected to mainland Europe. Australia, Tasmania, and Papua New Guinea would have been one giant landmass, and the dry bed of the South China Sea would have linked Sumatra, Java, and Borneo to mainland Asia. Human beings could be found in nearly every corner of the Old World, but the New World remained human being free, cut off from the rest of the planet. That is, until the formation of Beringia. The hunter-gatherers that trekked across Beringia 14,000 years ago weren't making a mad scurry across a flimsy rope bridge. This was a slow migration of people, battling the harsh elements, scarce resources, and impossibly frightening predators. Whether they knew they were crossing into a new continent or not was likely not at the top of their priority list. North America during this era was a very bleak and challenging place to be a human being. Mile-high glaciers, sub-zero temperatures, and giant ancient predators dominated this cold and bitter landscape. People were certainly far from the top of the food chain, which included American lions, the massive canine species called the dire wolf, and the enormous short-faced bear, Arctodus. This bear had a standing reach of over 12 feet and was large enough and fast enough to bring down horses and giant camels. These ferocious predators likely played a heavy role in why North America was explored so late in our human migration story. If towering glaciers and hurricane winds didn't stop us, paleontology's largest bear certainly did. As we know and discussed in the first episode of this series, fringe science can, and often does, become accepted science. Although not always. Fringe science and other hints and clues point to human beings making it to North America prior to this traditional narrative we all learned growing up. Some abnormalities in the record point to human beings migrating to the New World much earlier, perhaps as early as 100,000 years ago, or perhaps by much different means, such as boats and rafts via the Pacific Ocean in South America. While very compelling and thought-provoking, the clues to this hidden story are still few and far in between. There is, however, definitive evidence in the archaeological record that the peopling of North America occurred roughly 15,000 years ago. One day, this fringe science might become accepted science, or it might not. We'll just have to wait and see. The first folks that would have spoken of the Great Plains are referred to by anthropologists and archaeologists as Paleo-Indians. More than 15,000 years ago, these tenacious hunter-gatherers made their way through the icy tundras and glaciers of the Ice Age by foot, making their way down the western coast of the United States. By approximately 12,000 years ago, scientists have the first accepted evidence of human beings living in the Midwest on the central plains of Nebraska. These conclusions are based on the analysis of excavations made in the southwestern U.S. in the 1920s and 30s. Discovered in Clovis and Folsom, New Mexico, the so-called Clovis and Folsom cultures used distinctively shaped, specialized fluted stone spear points, representing a unique and advancing society and people. Clovis and Folsom kill sites, burn pits, and other evidence can be found from the Southwest to the Great Lakes, and everywhere in between, including the Cornhusker State. The Great Plains environment and climate has changed dramatically since the first human beings lived here, over 10,000 years ago. Many of the grasslands and rolling hills we've seen today were once punctuated by large patches of wooded pine forests, and these lands were home to many diverse and distinct animals, herbivores and carnivores alike. The largest of these animals included woolly mammoths, ancient bison, horses and camels, and even giant sloths. Early Nebraskans hunted these strange and exotic animals using their specialized fluted spear points, and, as the traditional tale is told, hunted these animals to their complete and total extinction. At the tail end of the last glacial maximum, during what is known as the Quaternary Extinction Event, over 50 groups of large animals, including the classic Ice Age mammals like mammoths and mastodons, became extinct in North America. The Paleo-Indians living in Nebraska 12,000 years ago would have lived through monumental shifts in their daily lives and surrounding environment. What would have the people of the plains spoken of during this time? While many, including myself, don't doubt the environmental destructiveness of human beings, the overkill hypothesis, as it's known, is facing more and more scrutiny, with new discoveries and evidence coming to light. Did human beings hunt 50 groups of large megafauna to their complete and total extinction? Perhaps there's more to this story than we were taught growing up. As folks were making their way across the plains, the Earth was entering an interglacial period, and the climate was slowly warming up and becoming wetter, more characteristic of today's environment. Unexpectedly, though, 12,900 years ago, the Earth was plunged into a chaotic cold snap, reversing the prior warming trend. This cold, dry, and disruptive time period lasted for 1,200 years and came to a sudden and just as mysterious halt 11,700 years ago. This time is known as the Younger Driest, and its origin is still unknown and hotly debated. What we do know with certainty is that the earliest people that inhabited North America and Nebraska witnessed a tremendous event that forever changed the trajectory of their cultures, and all cultures across planet Earth. One hypothesis for the origin of this global cold spell is known as the Younger Driest impact hypothesis, which was first published in 2007, my senior year of high school. This fringe science postulates, and with sound evidence, that a series of comets or asteroids struck Canada and the ice sheets 12,900 years ago, resulting in a massive catastrophe of flooding, fires, extinctions, and dramatic climatic change in North America and beyond. There may be geological evidence of this extraterrestrial impact in the layers of the land itself in Nebraska. In 2019, I had an opportunity to listen to author Graham Hancock discuss his book Before America and the topic of the Younger Driest impact hypothesis. It was wonderful getting to listen to one of my favorite authors discuss the importance of Nebraska to our ever-evolving view of human history. To summarize Hancock's work, a series of elliptical rainwater basins located along the Platte River near Fairmont, Nebraska, may actually be impact craters from this ancient event 12,900 years ago. These impact craters were hidden in plain sight, you might say. Whether all of this evidence will remain in the fringe science category or eventually become accepted science will remain to be seen. It's only been since my high school days that this intriguing evidence has come to light. Who knows what human beings will discover in the coming years and decades? What a time to be alive. In the wake of the Younger Driest impact event, North America and Nebraska were left burned, deluged, and radically transformed. Gone as well were the Clovis and Folsom cultures and their people, supplanted by the various tribal groups that occupied the Great Plains from 10,000 years ago to 1000 BCE. This long expanse of time is known by anthropologists as the Archaic period. These are the first human beings to re-establish themselves in the destructive aftermath of the younger Driest. By 9,000 years ago, the climate had recovered, the final ice age had ended, and the climatic patterns somewhat characteristic of the modern period were first established. This is the time known as the Holocene epoch, which we human beings presently live in, although some would say we're currently in the next geological phase, the Anthropocene. Many of the massive animals that had once dominated the Great Plains during the Ice Age, including mammoths, mastodons, and the majority of super predators like the short-faced bear, became extinct by either dramatic environmental change, human intervention, or likely a combination of both. Camels, horses, llamas, and most other exotic animals all died out. The horse would not return to the Great Plains until the arrival of the Spanish in the 1500s. Human beings, once again, had to adapt their ways in response to shifts in climate and their surrounding environment. Because that's what human beings do. People during the Archaic period, known appropriately as the Archaic People, continued to live a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle, migrating throughout the year in search of food and other necessities. The sandhills of western Nebraska formed during the Archaic period, between 5,000 and 8,000 years ago. And so these people would have been hunting great herds of bison as the sandhills formed around them. Permanent villages have not yet been found in the archaeological record from the Archaic period, although tribes likely return to the same location from year to year based on animal migrations and other seasonal cycles. New and innovative types of tools appear in the record as well, demonstrating ingenuity, adaptability, and cultural progression. Archaic people introduced a variety of spear point styles, possibly representing distinct, localized cultural groups with their own unique skills and attributes. These various cultural groups are usually named and classified based on the types of spear points found at kill sites, just as the Folsom and Clovis cultures before them. It appears that while these tribal people did move from region to region across the Great Plains, they were much more localized than during the Paleo-Indian period, whose tribes traveled much further and risked hunting much larger prey that eventually went extinct. This points to evidence that the people during this time were rapidly increasing the intensity and efficiency of their local lands. These were the first settlers of Nebraska. Some of the best archaeological evidence we have of the Archaic period and its people was discovered in southwestern Nebraska, near the towns of Curtis and Stockville in Frontier County. On June 25, 1947, archaeologists from the Nebraska State Museum, a place we should be very familiar with from the previous episode, found evidence of these ancient people in the Medicine Creek drainage basin. Known as the Lime Creek Site, at least two major layers of cultural artifacts and material were discovered, one dating from 9,000 years ago and another from 7,000 years ago. Some of this material that archaeologists sifted through included tools made from bones and stone, fire pits surrounded by charred remains, and discarded bits of animal scraps that these people couldn't fashion into anything useful. Considered one of the most thorough and well-preserved sites of the Archaic period, the Lime Creek Site is one of many examples of Nebraska's stunning archaeological and anthropological history, and it's very fitting that the Lime Creek Site was discovered in Frontier County, Nebraska. As human beings have been doing throughout our history, the people of the plains began trading with the people of the woods, and soon new cultural partnerships and networks formed across the continent. These groups are known as the Plains Woodland people. Anthropologists point to evidence that small-scale agriculture began to develop among Native Americans in the southeast around 1000 BCE, marking a slow transition to what is known as the Woodland period in Native American history. The Plains Woodland people of Nebraska engaged in limited farming as well, although they were still more bug-eaters than Cornhuskers during this time period. This era lasted a couple of thousand years, until roughly 1000 CE, the High Middle Ages, from the European perspective. As we'll learn more about in the upcoming episodes, one of the most persistent issues that folks living on the plains would have spoken of is the lack of trees. Wood, timber, and its byproducts are highly valuable resources and are needed for shelter construction, tool manufacturing, fuel, and fire. This culture's mark on history was engaging in long-distance trade with eastern and western tribes for the acquisition of exotic items such as marine shells, obsidian, and raw materials such as wood and timber. Hence their appropriate name, the Plains Woodland People. One of the most important and pristine archaeological finds of the Plain Woodlands people was discovered right in my backyard of Valley County. This marks an exciting point in this podcast, as I can localize Nebraska's deep history to within just a few miles of the home I grew up in. Known as the Schultz Site, this archaeological excavation is located in the drainage basin of the North Loop River on the north bank of Myra Creek. This is in southeastern Valley County, only a few minutes' drive from my hometown of Ord, Nebraska. The Schultz Site is composed primarily of a plains woodland village with evidence of at least 9 lodge sites and 3 storage pits identified during excavations. Discoveries at the site suggest that the occupants were largely semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers, hunting bison, deer, and other large animals. In fact, this dig site is so complete and well-preserved that it is considered the type site of this culture, and bears the same name. Known as the Valley Variant or Valley Focus people, this culture was active in the Loop River Valley between the years 1 to 500, roughly the same time as the Roman Empire in Europe. The Schultz Site was first excavated and studied in the 1930s under the guidance of the Nebraska State Historical Society and with funding from the Works Progress Administration, part of FDR's New Deal program. This federally funded initiative was instrumental in identifying and naming the Valley Focus culture, the first culture to be identified and classified in the prehistory of the Loop River Valley. Thank you, socialism. Somehow, us youngsters were never taught about this important archaeological site growing up, even though I went to school only a few miles from its location. It took until my early 30s nerd alert stage before I first learned about the Schultz Site. Better late than never. As trade continued between the plains and the woods, technological advancements and cultural innovations continued to be exchanged and traded between each other, transforming Nebraska and its people's ways of life once again. A critical piece of technology allowed for the permanent settlement of the Great Plains. Pottery. Pots, basins, vessels, and other clay containers were key for several reasons. They allowed for the storage and easy transportation of food and belongings, made cooking and boiling water much more efficient, and they certainly made taking out the garbage less of a chore. And so, after the Plains Woodland period, Nebraska and the Great Plains became home to a new name in Nebraska's story, the Central Plains village culture. If God made a farmer, these were the first farmers he made. The tribes of the Central Plains village tradition were the first people we have archaeological evidence of permanent villages and year-round occupation. These first farmers began to raise significant quantities of corn, beans, and squash, known by natives as the Three Sisters. These staple crops made their way from the east and the west, arriving from the river valleys of Mississippi, Mexico, and Mexico Nuevo. These so-called village people manufactured garden hose and other cultivation tools from the shoulder blades of bison, and they built underground earth lodges to store their crops, dried meat, and other food surpluses. Although they lived in villages and raised crops, these people still gathered wild plants and hunted wild animals. However, the Central Plains village culture was becoming much more reliant on the three sisters of beans, squash, and of course our favorite, corn. Because the Central Plains village culture lived a more agrarian, settled way of life, many of their artifacts and remnants can be found in numerous archaeological sites around Nebraska. One of the most significant investigations of the Central Plains tradition is known as the Patterson Site, located along the Platte River near the junction of Highway 31 and Interstate 80, between Lincoln and Omaha, Nebraska. The Patterson Site is a 1,000-year-old Native American village, representing a typical location for people of the Central Plains tradition, as it was near water and an abundant supply of timber and wildlife. Small gardens were cultivated, and wood harvested from the river valley was used for shelter construction, fuel, and for crafting tools and weapons for use in trade. Although the Patterson Site is one of the most pristine discoveries, there are literally hundreds that have been found across the Great Plains. And once again, in a tale as old as time, our ancestors' way of life suddenly changed and fundamentally transformed. For mysterious and still unknown reasons, the Central Plains village tradition began to decline in the centuries before the first European contact, and the majority of permanent settlements were largely abandoned hundreds of years before Columbus's landing in 1492. Numerous tribes that once covered most of present-day Nebraska moved out of the region or died off completely, and the number of Native American communities declined dramatically. For the next 300 years, small groups of native Nebraskans were confined to the Missouri River and its tributaries in northeastern Nebraska. Only the lush rivers of the Great Plains were occupied, beginning in the 1300s, until the Pawnee, Omaha, and Oto returned to the region in the early 1700s, tribes that European explorers came to know and document in historical times. And for those 300 years, archaeologists have lost the trail of the Central Plains village culture. Scientists continued to search for clues beneath the soil to find out exactly what happened to these early Nebraskan farmers. Just like the younger Driest cold snap, what would have the people of the plains spoken of during this time, as they left their villages and abandoned their former ways of life? Nebraska was not the only region to experience major cultural shifts in the centuries prior to the first European contact. Other complex Native American societies, such as those found in the Southwest and the Mississippi Valley in the Southeast, all began to crumble around the year 1300. What factors could have affected such a large region of diverse people and cultures? Perhaps it was due to drastic changes in the climate, overpopulation, intertribal warfare over limited food, wood, and animals, disease, or likely a combination of all the above. The Ice Age may have made one final last gasp. A cold snap known as the Little Ice Age during this time may have played a key role in these cultural disruptions. In Europe, we certainly have evidence of this Little Ice Age causing widespread social chaos and cultural and religious revolution. There are common threads between these European cultures and the Central Plains tradition, including the reliance on complex trade networks and having consistent food surpluses. It only takes a couple of short summers and poor harvests for everything to get turned upside down. Perhaps this is what happened to the Central Plains tradition. And it is here, during this strange and mysterious time in Nebraska's history, that we leave off today's episode. The European explorers, settlers, and conquerors would find the Great Plains open, expansive, and with few human beings living on the prairie. The potential for alternative history here is fascinating and fun to speculate. What if Columbus would have landed in the year 492 instead of 1492? Or the year 1992? Thoughts for another podcast, but hopefully these questions can offer perspective. Human beings are about to get caught up in the gears of history as the old world and new world encounter each other for the very first time. While the first episode in this series was told primarily through geology and paleontology, and this episode through archaeology and anthropology, the next episode will be told through history, warfare, and geopolitics, as the first Europeans make their way into the Midwest and onto the Great Plains of Nebraska. Thanks once again, everybody, for listening to the Human Being Human podcast. I'm your creator and host, Carrington Cooper. Please join me for the next episode, and we'll see each other on the other side. You can follow this podcast on Facebook, Twitter, as well as Patreon. I'll be posting links to all the references mentioned throughout this series, as well as any other stories, videos, articles, or other cool and fascinating stuff that might be of interest. I would like to offer a special thanks to Two-Phase for providing today's song, Jasmine Flower, and reminding all of us, it's always better to ask for forgiveness than permission. I appreciate all of your ears and support, and we'll see you next time.